This is Democracy Now!
This afternoon, the Trump campaign filed a lawsuit to stop the counting of ballots in Pennsylvania. That is simply wrong. It goes against the most basic principles of our democracy.
As AP calls Michigan and Wisconsin for Joe Biden, moving him closer to the presidency, the Trump campaign files lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia to stop the vote count, while he calls for every ballot to be counted in Arizona and Nevada, where he's behind. Joe Biden now has a 3.5 million vote lead nationwide. We'll speak with Democracy Now's Juan Gonzalez about the demographics of who turned out to vote. We'll also go to Arizona to look at how this once red state is turning blue. We'll go to Phoenix to speak with Marissa Franco, co-founder of Mi Gente. And we'll be joined by New York Congress member-elect Mondaire Jones. He's set to become one of the first two openly gay black members of Congress.
I'm so thrilled to be running on a platform of Medicare for all, the only health care proposal that would literally ensure everyone in the richest nation of the world has health care in the midst of a global pandemic, where people have been losing their health insurance as they have lost their jobs.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The presidential race remains too close to call, but Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is closing in on securing enough electoral votes to win after news outlets projected him winning two key states in the Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan. According to the Associated Press, Biden has now secured 264 electoral votes. He will reach the needed 270 if he wins any of the four undecided races. Nevada, where he has a slim lead of less than 8,000 votes. Georgia, where Trump is winning by 18,000 votes, but many tens of thousands of votes have yet to be counted. North Carolina, where Trump is leading by 77,000 votes. Or Pennsylvania, where Trump is up by 165,000, but many absentee ballots have still not been counted. Biden briefly spoke on Wednesday.
I'm not here to declare that we've won, but I am here to report that when the count is finished, we believe we will be the winners.
President Trump made multiple false claims on Wednesday, suggesting Democrats are stealing the election. At one point, Trump wrote on Twitter he was claiming for electoral vote purposes the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, even as votes are still being counted. The Trump campaign also filed lawsuits in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and Georgia, and has requested a recount in Wisconsin. On Wednesday, Wisconsin's chief elections official, Megan Wolfe, said Trump's claims of electoral fraud are an insult to election workers.
Anybody's welcome to watch that process. Some of the places even live streamed their tally last night. And so I think that it's insulting to our local election officials to say that yesterday's election was anything but an incredible success.
On Wednesday, dozens of Trump supporters stormed a vote-counting center in Detroit, Michigan, banging on windows and doors behind which election officials were busy counting mail-in ballots. Stop that count! 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 Detroit is a largely African-American city. Meanwhile, another group of Trump protesters gathered in Arizona chanting, "Count the vote." Many of the protesters were openly carrying AR-15 assault rifles and other guns. A local TV news crew said they left the site after a Trump supporter threatened them and said he would find out where they live. While Fox and the Associated Press have called Arizona for Biden, the Trump campaign is hoping to win the state once all votes are counted. Pro-democracy protesters took to the streets in cities across the United States Wednesday, condemning Trump's efforts to steal the election. In Minneapolis, police arrested hundreds of marchers Wednesday night as they flooded Interstate 94. Here in New York, police kettled about 60 marchers at a Manhattan protest and arrested them. Earlier Wednesday, activist Linda Sarsour spoke at a protest outside the New York Public Library.
Today, we demand that every vote is counted. Tomorrow, we organize and we fight regardless of who goes to the White House.
In Maine, Republican Susan Collins has been elected to a fifth U.S. Senate term, defeating Maine's Democratic House Speaker Sarah Gideon. Collins was thought to be vulnerable after she cast a deciding vote to confirm President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, despite sexual assault allegations against him. In Michigan, first-term Democratic Senator Gary Peters appears poised to win his second term in a close race with Republican John James. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, Democrats would need to flip 2 more Senate seats to retake the majority in the Senate. Their best chances in Georgia, where Republican Senator David Perdue is just over the 50% mark needed to prevent a runoff election against Democrat Jon Ossoff. If Perdue falls below the 50% threshold, that race would head to runoff in January, when Georgia voters will also decide on a second Senate race between Democrat Reverend Raphael Warnock and Senator Kelly Loeffler. House Democrats are discussing whether to replace Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House after Republicans scored unexpected victories Tuesday, cutting into Democrats' majority. That's according to The Hill, which reports 2 unnamed Congress members have been approaching colleagues and asking them to back House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries as the next House Speaker. Meanwhile, New Mexico has become the first U.S. state to elect women of color as its entire congressional delegation. Democrat Teresa Leger Fernandez is a supporter of Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. Republican Yvette Herrell is a member of the Cherokee Nation and former state representative in New Mexico's House. They join incumbent Congressmember Deb Haaland, who in 2018 became one of the first 2 Native American women elected to Congress. The United States reported more than 103,000 new coronavirus infections on Wednesday, the highest one-day toll for any nation since the start of the pandemic. 17 states reported record hospitalizations Wednesday, and the U.S. continues to lead the world in COVID-19 deaths, with over 234,000 reported. The U.S. confirmed about 600,000 new cases just in this last week, breaking yet another record. Italy's ordered 4 regions into lockdown to slow community spread of coronavirus, joining Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and other European countries with tough new measures. Kenya's ordered bars and restaurants to close and will ban political gatherings for 2 months as an exponential rise in coronavirus cases threatens to surpass July's peak. In Mexico, hospitals in the northern border city of Ciudad Juarez have reached capacity and began waitlisting patients amidst a surge of COVID-19 cases. Officials have imposed a nightly curfew and ordered the largely U.S.-owned factories known as maquiladoras to close on weekends. Across the border, overtaxed hospitals in El Paso have begun airlifting COVID patients to other cities in Texas. In Denmark, officials have ordered millions of minks to be killed amidst fears the animals are transmitting a mutated strain of the novel coronavirus back to humans. There are fears the new strain could be resistant to vaccines currently under development. A warning to our listeners and viewers, this story includes graphic descriptions of police violence. In Philadelphia, city officials have released body camera footage of the police killing of Walter Wallace Jr., the African-American 27-year-old father who was shot by 2 police officers while having a mental health crisis last week. The video shows police officers Sean Matarazzo and Thomas Munz shooting and killing Wallace as he stands outside his parents' home carrying a knife. A woman in the video can be heard repeatedly saying Wallace is mental as the officers point their guns at him. At one point, Wallace's mother stands between the officers and Wallace. In one video, a male voice can be heard saying, "Shoot him and get him." The officers then fire at least 7 rounds each at Wallace, who falls to the ground. Wallace's mother rushes to him saying, quote, "You killed my son." One of the officers responds, "He was effing chasing us." Wallace never appears to get closer than 10 to 15 feet away from the officers. In Texas, Williamson County Sheriff Robert Chody has lost his re-election bid to Democrat Mike Gleason after Chody was indicted on felony charges of evidence tampering related to the police killing of Javier Ambler. Ambler, who is African-American, was tasered to death during a traffic stop in March of 2019 as he told officers, "I have congestive heart failure and I can't breathe." Ambler's death was recorded by the former reality TV show Live PD, but the show's producers never publicly released the footage and later said they had destroyed it at Sheriff Chody's request. Mississippi voters have overwhelmingly approved a ballot measure overturning a Jim Crow-era electoral college provision for determining governors and other elected officials. The two-step process for selecting statewide office holders has helped preserve white supremacy in Mississippi politics since the law was enacted in 1890. African Americans make up nearly 40% of Mississippi's population. In Missouri, voters have narrowly approved a ballot measure reversing recent changes to the redistricting process that made state legislative races more competitive. Passage of Amendment 3 is a major victory for Missouri Republicans, who are now poised to maintain their supermajority control of the State House and Senate. In Delaware, Democrat Sarah McBride has been elected the first openly transgender state senator in the United States, defeating Republican candidate Steve Washington. In 2016, McBride became the first openly transgender woman to speak at a major party convention addressing Democrats in Philadelphia.
Will we be a nation where there's only one way to love, only one way to look, and only one way to live? Or will we be a nation where everyone has the freedom to live openly and equally? A nation that's stronger together.
The United States officially withdrew from the landmark Paris Climate Accord on Wednesday, drawing condemnation from governments and environmentalists around the world. This is Japan's top government spokesperson.
The climate change issue is a global challenge and isn't something affecting just a single country. It should be addressed by the entire international community. From that point of view, it's extremely regrettable that the United States is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement now.
Joe Biden has pledged to rejoin the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord on his first day in office. On Wednesday, Biden tweeted, quote, "Today, the Trump administration officially left the Paris Climate Agreement, and in exactly 77 days, a Biden administration will rejoin it." And in Madrid, Spain, activists with the climate action group Extinction Rebellion superglued themselves to the ground outside the entrance of the Agriculture Ministry Wednesday, demanding Spain's government do more to protect biodiversity. The activists say climate change and the loss of animal habitat threatens to spark new pandemics around the world.
We demand that measures to really solve this climate crisis are taken because, for example, the coronavirus is basically a problem that derives from climate change. It derives from the fact that little by little we are losing biodiversity, and one of the direct consequences is that we're losing the natural barrier that previously protected us.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I am Amy Goodman in New York with co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners around the country and around the world.
Well, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is closing in on securing enough electoral votes to win the election after news outlets projected him winning 2 key states in the Midwest, Wisconsin and Michigan. According to the Associated Press, Biden has now secured 264 electoral votes. He will reach the needed 270 if he wins any of the 4 undecided races: Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, or Pennsylvania. Biden briefly spoke on Wednesday.
And now, after a long night of counting, it's clear that we're winning enough states to reach 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. I'm not here to declare that we've won, but I am here to report that when the count is finished, we believe we will be the winners.
Trump made multiple false claims on Wednesday, suggesting Democrats are stealing the election. At one point, Trump wrote on Twitter he was claiming for electoral vote purposes the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, even as votes are still being counted. The Trump campaign also filed lawsuits in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia, and has requested a recount in Wisconsin. Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf criticized the Trump campaign's lawsuit.
This afternoon, the Trump campaign filed a lawsuit to stop the counting of ballots in Pennsylvania. That is simply wrong. It goes against the most basic principles of our democracy.
To talk more about the election and to look at who turned out to vote in this historic election, we're joined by Democracy Now!'s own Juan Gonzalez, who's been closely looking at who turned out to vote. He's joining us from New Brunswick, New Jersey, where he's a professor at Rutgers University. So, Juan, it is astounding what has taken place in this country. We are talking about a record-smashing number of voters. It is believed over 150 million people voted. Can you talk about the demographics of the vote? In the last days, the main narrative has been, before the election final day on November 3rd, that African Americans and Latinos were not coming out to vote for Joe Biden to the extent that it was believed they would be. But this is a narrative right now you are refuting. Can you talk about your findings?
Yes, Amy, and I've been poring over the numbers and trying to make sense of what happened in this election. And this developing narrative that Latinos and to some extent African Americans shifted more toward Donald Trump in this election, and they underperformed for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, I believe is a largely false narrative. I think the main story of this election, as you mentioned, that saw record turnout. We won't have the exact numbers, but it looks like about 158, 59, 160 million people, close to 160 million people voted. The main story is that people of color, especially Latinos, flocked to the polls in numbers that far exceeded what the experts had expected, while the total number of votes cast by white Americans barely increased from the last presidential election. And most importantly, that white voters, including white women, voted at higher percentages for Trump this year than they did in 2016. So how come none of the experts are asking why white voters underperformed the Democratic Party? And let me be a little bit more specific. There does appear to have been some areas of the country where there was an increase in the percentage of the Latino vote for Donald Trump, specifically in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and in the Miami-Dade County, both of which I should note, for those people who know the voting patterns of the Latino community, have always been relatively conservative areas of the Latino community in terms of voting. Even though South Texas is largely Democratic, it's always been a moderate to centrist or conservative Democratic voting bastion. But my analysis of the numbers shows a completely different story when you look at the country as a whole. And I'm doing this based on the exit polls that were most of the networks use, which is the Edison National Election Poll, which has always been, it's been criticized in the past precisely because it it gives doesn't give correct numbers or doesn't give valid numbers on the Latino community, but it's still the only massive exit poll that we have until we get more scientific studies that come maybe months later or a year later. So first of all, the historic turnout, right? If we take the number of 159 million, last election was 136 million people voted. So we're talking about an increase of 23 million voters compared to the last election. Phenomenal increase. Who were those 23 million people and where did they come from? So I think I have a chart here. I hope the producers are able to put it up here. But you'll see that according to the exit polls, 13% of the vote came from Latino voters, Latino Americans. That represents 20.6 million Latinos voted in this election. That is an incredible increase, 65% over the last election, which was already a record for Latinos when it was only 12.6%. For the first time in U.S. history, because Latinos have never voted at more than 50% of the eligible population. They've always been 45, 46, or even less. For the first time, about 2/3 of the eligible Latinos came to the polls. 8 million more Latinos voted in this election than voted in the last election. Then come the Asian Americans, a phenomenal turnout in the Asian American community, 3.6 million more votes than voted in 2016. And then African Americans also had an increase. They went from 17.1 million who voted in 2016 to 19 million, about 1.9 million. So that's an increase, but it's not an increase as you might expect after a year or 2 years now of massive racial justice protests and the pioneering candidacy of Kamala Harris, but it's still an increase. So what about white voters, the largest sector of the electorate? But a diminishing portion. In 2016, 100 million whites voted in the election. In this election, 103 million voted, just 2.7 million increase in the total white vote in the country. So the bulk of the increase of the vote in this election came from people of color, largely Latinos. So now people say, well, but there was a slight percentage increase in the among African Americans and Latinos for Trump. Well, percentages don't win elections. Votes win elections, right? And that's what you've got to understand. Would you rather have 70% of 12 million votes, or would you rather have 68% of 20 million votes? The increase has been so large, whereas the percentages have stayed roughly the same, that there was enormous increase in the votes by Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and African Americans for Biden and the Democratic Party. Why was this? And I think the enthusiasm and the turnout of the Latinx community was fueled by 4 years of constant Republican scapegoating and attacks on Latinos, from the disastrous response to Hurricane Maria for the Puerto Rican community, to family separations, and also to the terrible response of the Trump administration to the coronavirus. And it is why Arizona and Nevada and Colorado are likely, it seems, to go for Joe Biden. And what has happened now is that there is a new brown belt voting bloc that is developing in the Southwest that includes Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and very soon Texas as well. So the real underperformers in this election were white voters who not only did not have a qualitative increase in their vote totals, they dropped from 71% of the electorate to 65% of the electorate, but they voted in an even higher percentage for Trump this time than last time, or than they did for John McCain in 2008. And this is especially true in among white women. So now, how is this possible, given the years now of allegations of sexual assault against Trump, his denigrating of women, his family separation policies, that white women increased the percentage of the vote that they gave to Donald Trump. What's up with that? Why are all the commentators not dissecting what the heck is going on in white America and with white women in America? Unfortunately, it seems to me, looking at the numbers, there is no gender gap. There's a racial gender gap in that African American and Latina women are voting so overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, but not white women. And I think that needs to be analyzed more. And finally, I think the key issue here is that the United States, being the world's prime imperialist power with no real competition, no real adversaries who threaten it, and only China who can compete economically with the United States, that we are a country that is increasingly moving to a situation where the Republican Party is moving more and more to be the party of white people in America. And the Democratic Party is increasingly becoming the party of the new multiracial majority of the American people. That's what I take from the results of this election. No matter who ends up actually winning the election or what happens with the Senate or what happens with the Congress, it's the developing trends in the electorate of America that are showing an enormous racial division between the two parties and who they represent.
That's Juan Gonzalez, Democracy Now! Co-host and professor at Rutgers University, doing a deep dive, even as we're waiting to hear who has won the presidency in the United States, into the data. And Juan, maybe you can talk about the kinds of narratives that developed over 2016, the misinformation that continues to this day about who votes, like the more than half of white women who voted for Trump in 2016. You're exploding all of this.
Yes. Well, the exit polls were actually last time around were considerably off on the women's vote. In fact, the Pew Center later on and several other groups did more extensive studies and found that in the 2016 election, there was roughly an even vote between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton when it came to white women. I think it was 47 to 48%, because, of course, there were third-party candidates back in 2016 that took a portion of the women's vote as well. So it was 47 to 48. This time around, there is a clear majority that is showing that white women are voting for Trump. And I don't think that there's been any real analysis of what's happened there. And certainly no questioning by any of the political commentators that I've seen of why has Trump's support among white women increased since 2016. And I think that while it has not, or barely increased among African American and Latino women, I think that is something that's really got to be looked at. But I think that generally speaking, if you look at the historical trends, it's about 2/3 of Latinos going back to George Bush. George Bush was the last Republican candidate that was able to get 40% of the Latino vote. And Ronald Reagan back in the 80s got about 40% of the Latino vote. But back then it was a much smaller pie. It was a much smaller vote. Now it's a much bigger vote. And so when you're in the 28, 29, 30% as a Republican candidate, that's really not a substantial change in the vote. You've got to get up into the 35 or 40% where you can claim there's actual real movement occurring in the Latino community. So it's the historical trend has been Republicans generally get about between 25 to 35% of the Latino vote, because remember, Latinos are a very disparate group. There are many nationalities. Because of migration, there's constant change. People are saying, well, South Florida voted more for Trump. Well, the South Florida of today is not the same South Florida of 10 years ago, because South Florida has increasingly become the base area for all conservative Latin Americans, whether they're Nicaraguans fleeing social change in Nicaragua, Colombians, increasingly Venezuelans, and of course the old-style Cuban community. It is the refuge area for all people fleeing social upheaval and social revolution in Latin America. So it's no surprise that there may have been a conservative increase of the Latino vote in South Florida. And that's not a surprise at all. It's only a surprise to the people who don't pay attention to the evolution and the dynamics of the Latinx community across the country. But I think the key area is what's happened in Wisconsin, what's happened in Pennsylvania, what's happened in the Midwest, what's happened in Arizona, Nevada, where the bulk of the Latinx community exists, and of course Texas, where the bulk of the Latinx community lives and votes.
Juan, I wanted to ask you about Native Americans. I was communicating with someone last night from Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and they were talking about the big story in Wisconsin around Native Americans, although it is harder to track, is that right, because of who's identified demographically and who isn't?
Yes, well, I think certainly the Native American vote, not only in Wisconsin and in Montana and also in Arizona, has probably played a very big role in Arizona, along with the Latinx community. People talk about Maricopa County as being decisive in what happens in Arizona. Well, Maricopa County is 31% Latino. So it's the biggest county, and it has a very big share of the vote there. So I think that but in Arizona especially, I think, and in a few other states, a Native American vote will be crucial. But getting the hard numbers is going to take some time, because the sample that these pollsters use is so small that it's going to take a lot more digging to get the actual results.
Well, Juan, even though, as you say, it's very surprising that white women voters voted for Trump in greater numbers in this election than they did in 2016, given Trump's consistent assaults on women of all kinds. I guess the thing that's striking is also the fact, I mean, Trump did win over 60 million votes, 68 million votes. That given what he's done and said to and about African Americans, Asian Americans, the Latinx communities, that any increase, first of all, that any people would vote for him, and on top of that, that there would be an increase at all, even if marginal.
Yes, well, I agree with you, Nermeen. I think the issue to understand, again, that's why I raise the nature of U.S. imperialism. I do not think that we should underestimate the reality, because everyone knew why they were voting in this election. There were very few undecided voters, and I think one of the things that still has to be answered is how, once again, the polls were so wrong, not necessarily about the vote for Joe Biden, because most of the polls gave Joe Biden about 51, sometimes 52% of the vote, or 50, which is more or less what he's been getting. But there was a severe underestimation in all the polls, once again, of how many Americans were voting for Trump. And I think that we've got to understand increasingly these polls are highly suspect and cannot be trusted. But I think the key thing to understand is that, unfortunately, and I've been saying this now for years when I get a chance to do analysis rather than just ask questions, is that there is a significant portion of the American people, including among African Americans and Latinos and other groups, who are perfectly happy with the United States being the world's imperial power, and who to some degree or other believe that they are invested in the continued national chauvinism and expansionism and bullying of America around the world. So this vote also represents, even if Joe Biden wins, that there are many Americans who are perfectly happy with our country being a rogue state in the world, and lording over the rest of the world, and insisting that its interests are first. There is a national chauvinist movement in America, and a movement that believes authoritarianism is the way to go. We cannot underestimate this, and hopefully the progressives will attempt to organize understanding that. And the work that has to be done, though, is in the white community, is in among white Americans. That's where the organizing needs to be done, because that is the population that is increasingly shifting more and more to a national chauvinist and a white supremacist a view of the world. And I don't think that we can sweep that under the rug and act like it's not happening, because it is happening. And that's, I think, the key lesson that, yes, Donald Trump got more votes this time than he got last time. And there's a reason for that.
And Juan, I mean, as you say, Trump did get more votes, 4 million at the moment, 4 million more votes this year in this election than he did in 2016. And in 2016, when he won, there was almost universal consensus that he was an aberration. In other words, he was eccentric to what the Republican Party had been, what it stands for, whereas it's not really possible to hold that position now.
Right, because I believe that he's an aberration in his personal conduct and in the way he carries out the office, but not in the policies that he is implementing. The policies that he is implementing are pretty much in lockstep with conservative Republican policies that have been developing for decades. And that is why so many Republicans who really can't stomach the man still vote for him, because he is implementing the policies that they believe is where the country should go, whether it's deregulation, whether it's on the climate crisis, whether it's on immigration and so many other policies. He's implementing the policies on taxes. He's implementing the policies that the conservative Republican establishment wants. It's just that he does it in such a corrupt, venal, and personal manner that it's hard to stomach him at the same time.
Juan Gonzalez, we want to thank you for being with us. See you tomorrow on Democracy Now! A Democracy Now! Co-host and professor at Rutgers University, speaking to us today from New Brunswick, New Jersey. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we head to Phoenix, Arizona. Arizona, a key battleground state. It was red. Is it turning blue? Stay with us. Of Nothing by Los Lobos. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to the presidential race in Arizona, where Joe Biden's leading Donald Trump by more than 68,000 votes, with 86% reporting. The Associated Press and Fox News have called the state for Biden, and they did that over a day ago. But other outlets, including CNN, have yet to declare a winner. Biden's lead narrowed early. Thursday morning when Arizona announced results of a batch of mail-in ballot, mainly from Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix. Counting the remaining votes could take several days. Several hundred Trump supporters gathered outside the Maricopa County Election Center last night chanting, "Count the vote." Many of the protesters were openly carrying AR-15 assault rifles and other guns. Donald Trump won Arizona in 2016. So they were counting "Count the vote," and that's opposed to the group, what Donald Trump Jr. has referred to as the army of supporters that were outside a Detroit counting center where Trump was ahead in Michigan, and they were saying "Stop the vote" as they stormed into a counting center. But in Arizona, where they were behind, that Trump insisted they count every vote. Now, if Biden's lead holds in Arizona, he'll be just the second Democratic presidential candidate to win the state since 1948. Arizona's blue shift is in large part due to a decade of grassroots organizing, particularly in Latinx communities, against Arizona's anti-immigration policies and Maricopa County's infamous former sheriff, Joe Arpaio. Meanwhile, in a closely watched Senate race, Democrat Mark Kelly, the astronaut and the husband of Gabby Giffords, the congressmember from Tucson who was shot in the head. Yes, Mark Kelly has unseated Arizona Republican Senator Martha McSally. We go now to Phoenix, where we're joined by Marissa Franco. She's co-director and co-founder of Mi Gente, which means My People, a national digital organizing hub for Latinx and Chicanx communities, which this year has led a national campaign to mobilize Latinx voters. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Marissa. Talk about the significance of what's happening right now in Arizona, the explosion of the Latinx vote.
The lion's share, I think the first thing to say is that the lion's share of the credit belongs to sustained community organizing in the state. The other night, all of us were watching it. I think probably like many of you all, we were having this feeling of doom of 2016. And 2016, we had this moment of it was bittersweet, right? We finally took Sheriff Arpaio out of office, but really, as soon as that was announced, it was very clear that Trump was going to win the election. And so as we waited for the results this year, and we heard about Florida, we heard about, we started seeing the numbers coming out of Ohio and coming out of the Midwest. It felt really good this year to have our state be a shot in the arm. We were very excited about the results. At this point, we are still awaiting what the results are at the top of the ticket, but we have won seats at the County Board of Supervisors. The Red for Ed ballot initiative won. We've elected, it looks like, a progressive county attorney in Julie Gunnigal, and just continued to see, a shift in this state. And I think it's important to name that it's a shift that comes at the efforts of many, many people. It is sustained community organizing, and it's an embracing of a multiplicity of strategies. This is just as much owed to the people that took to the streets and protest, the people that called for boycotts, as much as it is the people who knocked hundreds of thousands of doors to register and mobilize voters.
And Marissa, what do you think accounts for the difference in Arizona and compared to other states when it comes to Latinx voters? Is it this organizing that you're speaking of?
Absolutely. And, Juan was after my own heart in your last segment because he's naming numbers that are astounding. Our community, that the main story of this election in reference to Latino voters is that we came out. We showed up and we showed out. The vast majority rebuking and rejecting the Trump agenda. Arizona is one example of how that's done. I think it's an example that can be replicated. I think we should not take for granted that this means that Arizona will always be blue or Latinos will always come out. And frankly, that's something that the Democratic Party does pretty often. Our community is an afterthought, and there isn't a substantive effort to think of what are the kind of issues that matter to us? How can we be engaged in a meaningful way? How are we involved in decision-making and leadership of political campaigns? And often are getting the very short end of the stick on resources as well. And so, frankly, there's, you could probably look at a lot of different examples. Arizona is one of them. And the Arizona example, I think, it really demonstrates that consistent, sustained organizing is really critical for the community to actually feel that something is changing and that they have a role in it.
And Marisa, can you talk about the significance, and we don't know the results yet of the election, but what's at stake on immigration issues in particular now?
It's big. It's, we're really clear in our organization when we engaged in an endorsement process and we decided to participate in this election in a more active way. We made it very clear we were not picking our savior. We were picking our target. For immigrants and the immigrant rights movement across the country, these have been very difficult times. We've seen our advances dismantled or attempted to be dismantled, and there's been very little opportunity to have anything positive or progressive. Immigrants are largely under attack. The numbers, but the conditions, it's just, I think it's been one of the things that the Trump administration has most focused on in this first term. We can only expect in this first term they were understanding that they would have to face re-election. I think we don't want to imagine what they're going to do in the second term. A shift in administration would give us a fighting chance. It would give us a fighting chance to advance the campaigns and causes that we need in terms of immigration and addressing deportations.
Can you talk about some of the sheriff's races, Marisa, that you've been following? And though you're based in Arizona, you work everywhere from Arizona to Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia in particular, folks in Georgia organized, mobilized. Obviously, we're still waiting for the results of the presidential election. But immigrants in the state of Georgia have faced, it's almost a tradition in the Georgia state legislature, similar to what's happened here in Arizona. It's almost tradition to pass anti-immigrant laws every year, year after year, year after year. Politicians who think they can make a name by disparaging us. And now this is the second cycle where people have come together to mobilize voters. 2 sheriffs have been knocked out in Gwinnett and Cobb County. These are sheriffs that have promoted the 287G program, which has long been a program that fuses local police with immigration enforcement and has been a catalyst to deportations. It's a huge victory. We're really proud.
Final words, 30 seconds, Marisa, on this cusp of the announcement of the president, which may come later today.
Yes, I want, as we wait these results, Trump and his supporters are showing who they are. In one place, they say to count the votes. In one place, they say to stop it. We must not give them a lifeline to relevance. We must not try to think that we're going to be able to just come and counter them. They cannot play the same plays. They cannot sue their way into the White House. Our movement needs to hold steady, that we need to count the votes. We are confident that we voted them out. And if we need to walk them out of that White House, we will. Let's hold down. Let's hold steady. Let's not give Trump supporters a pathway to any form of moral high ground. They are showing us who they are. They're showing everyone who they are, and let the world see it.
Marisa Franco, thanks so much for being with us. Director and co-founder of Mi Gente, national digital organizing hub for Latinx and Chicanx communities, which this year has led the national campaign called Fuera Trump to mobilize Latinx voters. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, we go to one of the first 2 openly gay Black Congress members-elect in this country. Stay with us. Where Shall I Be by Eric Bibb. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to New York, where Democrats Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres are set to become the first two openly gay black members of Congress, replacing lawmakers who are retiring after decades in Washington. Richie Torres will represent New York's 15th district in the Bronx. Mondaire Jones will represent New York's 17th congressional district, including Rockland County and parts of Westchester County. He is replacing the longtime Congress member Nita Lowey. Mondaire Jones joins the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, supports the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, a $15 minimum wage an hour. We welcome you to Democracy Now! These are historic wins coming as the Democrats have held on to their majority in the House but lost races in key conservative districts they won in 2018. Mondaire Jones, welcome back to Democracy Now! It was great to have you with us on election night. Can you talk about what your plans are right now? We are speaking to you on the eve of the announcement of who won the presidency today. What does your victory mean for this country?
And what a joy it will be when the future President Biden is able to announce his victory in the coming hours or days. With respect to my own election, it means that the era of small ideas is over. You know, I ran proudly on a progressive platform from the very beginning of my campaign, which, as you may recall, began as a primary challenge. And then it became an open seat, and anyone who had ever aspired to run for Congress relocated to the district, including the son of a billionaire who spent $5.4 million. People told me not to run on Medicare for All. They said it was too polarizing. In the midst of a global pandemic, it had more resonance than ever before. And so I'm really grateful to have defied expectations and conventional political wisdom throughout the course of my year and maybe 4 months long campaign.
Mondaire Jones, you've spoken out about your experiences growing up, saying for you that policy is personal. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, you know, unlike the people we're used to seeing in our politics, I don't come from money or from a political family. I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, and I was raised by a young single mom who, like so many incredible women all throughout my district and all throughout this country, worked multiple jobs just to put food on the table for us. So when politicians in Washington debate the need for a $15 minimum wage, that's not an abstraction for me. In fact, the $15 minimum wage or living wage is a need I know to exist from firsthand experience. And by the way, my mom got help raising me from my grandparents. My grandfather was a janitor and my grandmother cleaned homes. And when daycare was too expensive, she took me to work with her. And so when people like Elizabeth Warren talk about the need to invest in universal childcare as infrastructure, that's a fight I want to join when I get to Washington, based on not wanting any kid to have to go through what I went through when I was growing up.
So, Mondaire Jones, could you talk about where election results stand now? You've previously advocated for election reforms, including ranked choice voting and nationwide automatic voter registration. First, your response to how close this race has been, and then what you think the reforms you've advocated for, how that might change the way elections turn out.
You know, we are still watching the data roll in these swing states in particular. But, you know, your point is well taken. I think many of us on November 3rd expected the margins not to be what they were. We expected them to be more favorable, the vote count, towards Joe Biden. Of course, the absentee ballots skew heavily Democratic. And many folks who are expert in this area warned us not to freak out on November 3rd. So I'm waiting patiently with respect to that. We'll continue to press for democracy reforms. We have seen democracy reforms work here in New York State, where I reside. Early voting was a tremendous boon, and in fact has saved a number of my colleagues, I think, in various parts of New York State that are more competitive than my own district here in New York 17th. And court expansion will have to continue to be part of the conversation. Obviously, if the Senate majority continues to be Republican, the prospects for court expansion are significantly dimmer than they were just a few days ago when we expected a Democratic control of the Senate.
And I notice you're using the word court expansion, not court packing. But I wanted to ask you about another issue, Munder, and that is, or Congressmember-elect, the USPS, the U.S. Postal Service, shows thousands of mail ballots missed Election Day deadlines. Could be tens of thousands of ballots not getting to be counted. You're involved in a lawsuit against the United States Postal Service yourself that was just settled. Is that right? Can you talk about the significance of this, with the Postmaster General being Louis DeJoy, a mega donor to President Trump's campaign?
Absolutely. You know, I've been talking about how so many of our institutions have failed us these past few years, to say nothing of systems like our healthcare system and the economic system that we have that is rigged towards the wealthy and the well-connected and big corporations. One of those institutions is the Postal Service. Who would have thought that I would have to sue the Postmaster General and the President of the United States to suspend so-called operational changes, which were meant to undermine a free and fair election this cycle? We got a nationwide injunction maybe over a month ago at this point. And part of the relief in the Southern District of New York was the treatment of all election mail as either priority or first class, and then the pre-approval of overtime from the period spanning October 26th, I believe, through or 24th through November 6th. And so these were common sense things, in addition to weekly reports to confirm, for the district court judge to confirm compliance with his order. But it is not surprising to me that deadlines were missed. And of course, there's been litigation over this. If something's in the mail and it arrives within a reasonable, if something is in the mail and it arrives, it ought to be counted. And unfortunately, Republicans at the state legislative level and in Congress, and even with the Supreme Court as an accomplice, have been working to undermine that basic principle that all votes should be counted.
Mondaire Jones, your response to Trump's accusations that the Democrats are trying to steal the elections and to get vote counting to stop in critical states?
You know, it is not anti-democratic to just want every vote to be counted. And I was casually watching cable television yesterday when I was with my brother and his wife, and you know, I saw that at least some Republican senators also shared that view that they publicly expressed. I think it was Mitch McConnell and Mark Rubio suggested that every vote should be counted. And so I think they're getting tired of this president and his antics as well.
What's going to be the first? Go ahead, Nermeen.
That some of the policies you've advocated, Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, these are not policies that Biden has endorsed.
You know, I am really impressed by his climate proposal. It is the most ambitious climate plan offered by any major party nominee for the presidency of the United States. And it is a version of a Green New Deal. It's why you see people, organizations like the Sunrise Movement and authors of the Green New Deal, or co-authors of the Green New Deal, like Senator Ed Markey, so excited about working to enact it, as am I. Medicare for All is going to continue to be a battle. Obviously, a public option would be an improvement upon the status quo. Let's see what the Senate looks like, and let's see what Joe Biden is able to do using the office of the presidency to get Republicans to come to the table if they maintain their majority in the Senate.
Mondaire Jones, we want to thank you for being with us. Democratic Congressmember-elect for New York's 17th Congressional District, one of two openly gay black members of Congress, the first making history in this country. That does it for our show. You can track the presidential election, see the latest vote count state by state at DemocracyNow.org. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Miriam Barnard. I'm Amy Goodman, Nermeen Sheikh.